I'll be upfront about it. This episode will deal with a fair bit more personal interpretation and headcanon than some others. More so than Thornclaw or even Hazeltail, Toadstep doesn't have much time in the canon series to establish himself, and he isn't put in close proximity to the main characters or conflict in that time. But he has become one of my favorite and most dear characters over the past couple of years. I will of course still base my explanation in all the canon material that exists, and then explain the reasoning for expansion upon it. Toadstep doesn't actually live for very long in the books. While he and his sister Rosepetal were born in Outcast, the third book of Power of Three, they weren't old enough to show any character until Eclipse, and they remained kits until the end of the arc. Then by the beginning of Omen of the Stars, they time-skipped all the way to becoming new warriors, and after that single arc of being a minor character, he caught an illness in Dovewing's Silence and passed away between that book and Bramblestar Storm. In such a short time, how could he have enough content to captivate me? Well, much like Hazeltail or Thornclaw, my fascination with him began with his relationships. First is his mother, Daisy. She's a former Horseplace cat, and, after joining ThunderClan, stays as a permaqueen and keeps her original name, making her rather distinct from most other possible mothers in the clan. I always believed that the relationships between Daisy and her kits would be quite diverse and interesting, an idea that I followed through on when designing Berrynose, Hazeltail, and Mousewhisker's individual journeys through the clan, and how being Daisy's kits would impact them. I wanted to apply similar logic to Toadstep and Rosepetal. However, there are a couple of large differences between the two litters. First is the timing of their births. Berrynose, Mousewhisker, and Hazeltail were originally born as Berry, Mouse, and Hazel in the Horseplace, and in fact returned to the barn for a short time when Berrykit's tail got torn off by a fox trap. They were enamored enough with clan life to convince Daisy to go back, with Brambleclaw and Cloudtail's help, but it doesn't change the fact that they're much closer to their outsider heritage than Toadstep and Rosepetal were, and they faced a great deal more of the complaints from their clanmates, as well as the other clans. Second is their fathers. Now, let me be clear that neither Smokey nor Spiderleg were good mates or parents. Daisy has had awful luck with Toms, especially if you add in Cloudtail and his behavior in the latter half of the New Prophecy. But Smokey and Spiderleg were bad fathers in different ways. Smokey never cared about Daisy. In fact, he actively chose Floss over her time and time again and barely noticed when Daisy and her kits left. Berrynose, Mousewhisker, and Hazeltail grew up almost entirely without a father. Toadstep and Rosepetal, by contrast, did know their father, and in Toadstep's case, he lived his whole life with his father in the same camp. Spiderleg actively rebuked and ignored them, and even after Jayfeather and Leafpool tell him to spend more time with his kits, we never see them getting any closer once Omen of the Stars starts, after the time skip that made Toadstep and Rosepetal warriors. They, even more so than Daisy's first litter, would have Spiderleg's attitude and active refusal to be in their lives held over their heads. Toadstep shows himself as a kit to be adventurous and self-assured, but with an overprotective mother on one side and a distant, disdainful father on the other, many of his attempts at adventure were shot down. I imagine this having a couple of different effects, with the first being distance from his siblings. Berrynose, Hazeltail, and Mousewhisker had already carved out their own paths in the clan as new warriors by the time Toadstep was born, so he already had distance from them. But his relationship with Rosepetal is more interesting. As early as Eclipse, when they are both still very young kids, they show their different personalities. Where Toadkit is energetic and impulsive, Rosekit is thoughtful and sharp-tongued, scolding her brother multiple times for his actions and comments. Rosekit's behavior reminds me, and may well remind Toadkit, of Spiderleg himself, and whether intentionally or not, I think it's telling that Rosekit seems to imitate her distant father, even when that imitation doesn't result in any more affection. Still, despite their differences, Toadkit and Rosekit are practically inseparable for the whole of their kithood. Enough that when Rosekit becomes sick and is taken to the Two-Leg Den, Toadkit desperately calls out for her and wants her to come back. However, once they become warriors in Omen of the Stars, things change. We don't know what their apprenticeship was like under Squirrelflight and Cloudtail, but perhaps the lack of friendship between their mentors and the variety of other apprentices to play with made them grow more distant from each other. Whatever the case, Toadstep only does one patrol with Rosepetal in each of the first 3 books of the arc, and after that their lives never cross again. There are even signs in Fading Echoes, with Toadstep paying more attention to Ivypaw than Rosepetal, and in Night Whispers, with Toadstep having to specifically reach out to Rosepetal to even go on a single patrol with her, that the gap between them is growing. Toadstep is a consistently energetic and affectionate Tom, but his sister's attitude, along with the different paths in their lives, seem to have drawn them apart over time. Maybe having someone around who reminds you of your awful father isn't the best experience. But Spiderleg's place in Toadstep's life had another, very different and much better effect as far as I'm concerned. Lionblaze. As a kid, Toadstep witnessed the Battle of Eclipse, with all 4 clans fighting on ThunderClan territory and inside camp, right in front of him in some cases. But it didn't faze him. In fact, it excited him, seeing how strong and talented cats were. Soon after, Toadkit asks Lionblaze to teach him some cool battle moves in case one clan invades again, and watches the Golden Tom's warrior ceremony. For my personal needs, I combined the purposes of these 2 events by having Toadkit witness Lionpaw specifically saving the nursery during the Eclipse battle, which is an early jumpstart to his idolization of Lionblaze. With Spiderleg missing from his life, a strong and protective Tom who does care about Toadkit is the best possible dream, especially given how cold Rosepetal can sometimes be and how little Daisy understands the danger or excitement of being a warrior. It makes perfect sense that, by the time of Sign of the Moon, Toadstep is able to enthusiastically admit that Lionblaze is his role model for being such an incredible fighter, and that he is so happy when he is able to team up with Lionblaze to save Bumblestripe from a dog. As far as canon is concerned, this is the only example of their relationship, but I wanted to go much further, especially given that I was including the period where Toadpaw and Rosepaw were apprenticed. In Paws of Stars, around the time of the Eclipse battle, Lionblaze is at perhaps his lowest level of self-esteem, having been duped by Tigerstar, no longer having Heathertail or anyone else to trust and be his friend, and having so little control over his power that he fights a whole patrol and nearly kills Crowfeather. The fact that Toadkit, then Toadpaw, takes this moment and event to begin idolizing him and wishing to have the power and skill that he does would only make him feel worse, and he would push the young Tom away. The power he holds isn't something to be proud of, and he doesn't want to be anyone's role model. But Lionblaze would also be able to empathize with Toadpaw in a lot of ways. He too has a sister who often surpasses him, in techniques during training as well as in adherence to the warrior code. He too, at one point, lacks parental figures that he feels close to, so soon after the fire scene where he has lost his trust in Squirrel Flight. And he too doesn't really know how he is meant to be a warrior or make his way in the clan. He never had the given destiny of Jayfeather or the precise ambition of Hollyleaf. For a lot of his life, he was pretty aimless. So if Toadpaw were to come to him, tell him about his situation, and ask for advice, I think Lionblaze would feel for him, and agree that they could work together to do better than either of them could alone. Now, the nature of this relationship, once it has begun, is entirely up to the preferences of the writer. One could easily make it a romantic relationship, or even give Toadstep a crush on Lionblaze without it being reciprocated. Or you could leave them as nothing but friends. Personally, I prefer to go with a different relationship, that of brothers. They came together when the lacking element in both of their lives was family, so it makes sense that they would fill familial relationships in each other's lives. Not to mention, the mix of admiration and responsibility, while both of them still truly need to learn together, reminded me more of older and younger siblings than it did a romantic relationship, or a father and son. There is someone who I would like Toadstep to bond with on a more romantic level. However, considering that falls under spoilers for my story, I will leave that for future me to disclose. Putting aside the romance, I think Toadstep would have a lot of interesting friendship possibilities with his whole generation. With Rosepetal, he would certainly always care for her, but their different priorities and her traits that remind him of their father could draw them apart. Blossompaw was always more Rosepetal's friend than Toadstep's for that same reason, but Bumblestripe could make a fine rowdy buddy if you take Toadkit's comments and his later saving the Tom from a dog as evidence, and Briarlight could mirror Toadstep's kindness with her own. And then, of course, there's Dovewing and Ivypool. As far as canon is concerned, Dovewing is mentored by Lionblaze, but whoever Lionblaze mentors would almost certainly have some great conversation options with Toadstep, who probably would have chosen to be Lionblaze's apprentice if he could. There are lots of interesting options to explore, based on how you set up the world in your own mind or story. Much like the generation at the beginning of The Power of Three, this one at the beginning of Omen of the Stars could also be quite interesting. Between Daisy, Millie, and Whitewing's litters, he and Rosepetal are the oldest, but he never takes up an air of superiority or even responsibility for the others like Berrynose or Hazeltail did. He seems to remain ever the younger brother, an eager, energetic, and spontaneous Tom who has enough compassion and optimism to carry him through, even after battle occurs, clan tensions rise, and dozens of cats are taken in to train and fight beside the Dark Forest in a full-on war against the clans. From a writer's perspective, this makes him both a useful and a relieving character. When the others are becoming depressed, or angry, or brooding, Toadstep is there to remind them of what good there is to be had now, or to look forward to when all of this is done. Because of how little confidence he has in himself, he has an almost infinite supply of faith in others to do what they must and win the day. Maybe that assurance behind them is just what some cats need to overcome their struggles. I love you, Toadstep, my favorite little boy. You're an adorable beacon of light, and I am so glad to have found you. I do hope some of you now understand my love for him as well. Thank you for watching, and always remember to laugh, to love, and to always keep your sights on the brighter futures awaiting you.